Every once in a while, a car comes around that really shapes automotive design for years to come. And such is the case with the 1961 Continental that you see here. And interestingly, this particular Continental is owned by Maury Callum, the individual who led Ford design for a number of years. His brother Ian led Jaguar design for a number of years too. But let's talk a little bit about this particular 61 Continental and then the 61 Continental in general. You have to imagine that this car was just an absolute knockout and so different from everything that was going on in the luxury space in 1961. Take a look at the 1961 Imperial in the inset, for instance, and well, you can see that car has a lot more sculpture and form and, well, visual interest perhaps than the relatively plain and understated 61 Continental that you see here. And same with the 61 Cadillac. Take a look at it. You have not only the fins, you have lower skegs, you have overall complex surfacing that is just contrasted so significantly versus the 61 Continental that you see here. That, by the way, was no mistake. Designers at Ford Motor Company wanted to take Lincoln into a completely different direction. And what many don't know is that the 61 Continental actually started life off as a design proposal for the 61 Thunderbird. Take a look here. You can see this is a two-door proposal for 61 Thunderbird bearing a very similar grille to what would end up on the 61 Continental, except for the texture of the grille and the Thunderbird logo. The car is quite similar, and it also obviously doesn't have four doors on it either. But that was really the design inspiration, was that designers were looking to redo the Thunderbird for 1961, and instead their proposal ended up becoming a Lincoln. Now, in 1961 and prior to that, Lincoln was really nearly dead. The 1958 to 60 cars had almost just kind of kicked it to the curb in the eyes of the automotive buying public. Those were not happy cars, and customers really were not buying them. They were extremely poor sellers. In fact, those first unibody Lincolns, yes, the 58 to 60 Lincolns were unibody. They're not body-on-frame vehicles. Were just mammoth machines, some of the largest production cars ever put on the road. And I think at the time they were the largest cars. That title would later go to the 1973 Imperial as the longest non-limousine production car. But the 1958 to 60 Lincolns were absolutely huge. And unfortunately, like I said, that didn't mean their success in the marketplace. In any case, as I previously mentioned, the styling efforts on the 61 Continental began as a design study for the Thunderbird. And you have to remember a bit about the Ford design leadership structure at the time. At the top was George Walker, who had previously been a design consultant until the mid-1950s for Ford. His firm had worked on and really designed the 1949 Ford, and he was eventually hired as Ford's vice president of styling in the mid-1950s. Underneath George Walker was Elwood Engel, who was a leader of Ford styling at the time, in charge of numerous studios. There was Joe Oros, who would later go on to work on the Mustang, and there was also John Najar, who had led quite a bit of the styling on the 58 to 60 Lincolns, and it's pretty amazing that John Najar could just do something completely different with respect to this car. But the car started life as the 61 Thunderbird proposal, and Engel had specifically directed his design team in that he wanted two vertical blades with the greenhouse nestled in between. That's how he described the design brief for the car to his designers. And as a consequence, you got the proposal that you see here, which is those vertical bladed fenders, very sharp, very pointed. And the greenhouse for the Continental was also inset and beneath the belt line, which was very rare for the time. And you get this trough in between the belt line and the door glass that would become a hallmark for Lincoln, and Mercury would rob that on some of their cars for some time going forward. So how did it come about that what was originally supposed to be a Thunderbird proposal morphed into the Continental proposal? Well, after the clay models had been completed and designers were confident in what they had pulled together, Robert McNamara, who was going to become Ford Motor Company president and later U.S. Secretary of State under John Kennedy, was asked to come down and take a look at the clay models for the new Thunderbird. Needless to say, McNamara liked the proposal so much, he was the one who suggested that they be redone as a four-door Lincoln Continental as opposed to a Thunderbird. This really surprised everyone in the building because Ford's management had already approved a 1961 Lincoln, and that was to follow kind of in the style of the 1958 to 60 models. But in this case, McNamara decided that this style and this clean look for the 1961 Continental was going to be best. And so the die was cast, and you ended up with the car that you see here. Now, interestingly, the design leader at Ford, who was putting together the original 1961 Continental proposal, was Gene Bourdonnais and his team, which included Don De La Rosa. Bourdonnais, as I mentioned, his proposal was sidelined in favor of Elwood Engel's team's proposal that was originally for a Thunderbird. And needless to say, this didn't endear Bourdonnais and Engel to one another. You can imagine it was probably tough for Bourdonnais, who was then head of the Lincoln studio, to have Elwood Engel's design brought to his studio and then asked to complete it as a Lincoln when they had already had a proposal for the 61 Continental approved for production. Bourdonnais had to be at least somewhat irate. And in the end, when George Walker retired as the styling leader at Ford, Gene Bourdonnais was the one who would get the job. Elwood Engel would not get the job, and he would leave to become vice president of design for Chrysler. And in that vein, it's seemingly obvious why the 1961 Thunderbird proposal that you see here, for example, has some elements of Imperials, particularly the 1967-ish Imperials out back. Well, Engel came from Ford, and he took a number of the styling ideas that Ford had rejected over to Chrysler. And someone once asked him why he did that when he came to Chrysler. Remember, he came to Chrysler after Virgil Exner was fired in 1962. Chrysler was not having great success. Its customers were not enjoying the designs that it was producing. And Engel's response to why he brought over so many different Ford design elements was simply that he really had no choice. He had to remake the entire lineup for Chrysler in relatively short order, and he came from Ford, so he brought a lot of those design elements there. Now let's discuss more about this beautiful 1961 Continental that you see here, and take a look at that front end, very similar to the proposals that you saw, except for the egg crate grille texture that, I guess, connoted luxury. Egg crate and luxury, for whatever reason, was always a thing for many years, even on Cadillacs and other high-end makes. And you notice here on the Continental, it has this trapped hood with the safety latch. These are not hinged at the front, they're hinged at the back. You kind of pull them up from the back and access the engine components that way. And I have to say the engine bays on these are not very big because that hood opening is not very large. A little bit harder to service than many other vehicles. I also don't quite know why the wipers are in the reverse direction on these Continentals, but that's how they were. If anybody knows, put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Otherwise, you can see the theme that was crystal clear here, these blade-like fenders that were very straight, very flat, and something that would continue on for Ford Motor Design all the way until Gene Bourdonnais retired. I would say the last vehicles with this look would be the Panther platform cars like the LTD, Crown Victoria, Mercury Marquis in the 80s and all the way up into the early 1990s before they were redesigned, as well as the Lincoln Town Car. That was kind of the last of this era of style. And it's kind of interesting because the design leader for Ford during that time, Gene Bourdonnais, who would retire in the early 1980s, was not the original proponent of this style of design for Ford, as I mentioned before, but I guess he embraced it going forward. And as we rotate around to this rear three-quarter view, notice how absolutely clean and unbroken the rear body sides are here. There's no crease, there's no nothing aside from the wheel arches to interrupt what is otherwise a very smooth body line. And it's just gorgeous. It stands in such sharp contrast to Cadillac and Imperial for 1961. You can see why this really set a new direction in terms of design. But it does have this beautiful kind of crown and convexity. The bottom portion of the car tucks underneath, and it's not completely slab-sided. It has some curvature to it, just a perfect amount to really make your eye stop and reflect upon what it is seeing. Now, there's also no real, let's say, smattering of chrome on the body side here or wide rocker moldings. There's little moldings that are done very tastefully, but the car is almost designed to accentuate the heft of the body side here. There's nothing to break it up. It's one piece. It's, like I said, no creases, nothing else. And so you get the sheer size. Your eye reads that sheer size very quickly. There's nothing that's trying to disguise it. Same with that C-pillar, the very formal style C-pillar that's kind of fat and chunky in a good way, I would say. Very similar to the design proposals that you saw for that 61 Thunderbird. I also want to point out the so-called Continental greenhouse that you see here. Notice that trough in between the belt line and then where the overall greenhouse for the car starts. There's that gap there, and the greenhouse is below the belt line. This is something that really hadn't been done before, where you had this trough on the vehicle, and it would continue on being a hallmark of Lincoln styling for a number of years, and Mercury would also rob it. You never saw this on a Ford, but you did see it on Mercury's, and you certainly saw it on Lincoln's for many years to come. And not just the big full-size Continentals, but even cars like the Mark III, for example, had this kind of a trough on them. So this was another element of Lincoln styling that continued on for years. Now, as we rotate around to the other side here, I'll just point out the deck lid, which kind of carries over the theme from the body side in that it's extremely simple. There's no creases. Rare to see a car with no deck lid crease running down the middle or anything like that during this time frame. That was very typical to have a crease in the middle. This is just one long kind of flat deck lid that gradually tapers as it goes rearward on the car in a beautiful manner. Notice how much lower the deck lid is with respect to the quarter panel at the rear of the car than it is up near the backlight. And that's just this beautiful, elegant kind of waterfall taper that you see that you don't see from the body side view. When you're looking at this car from side view, you just pick up that belt line and the top of the chrome molding. You can't see the deck lid. And as you rotate around the car, it kind of reveals itself to you, where you notice that the deck lid has that beautiful kind of form to it. I love that about this car, that it reveals things as you walk around it. I'll also point out that that belt line, the little kick up near the rear door, I think that's pretty cool, and it reminds me a little bit of the crease that was on the Continental Mark II. Remember that the inspiration for the designers were employing for that 1961 Thunderbird proposal, later the proposal for the Continental when it morphed into four doors, was supposed to be kind of a modern-day Continental Mark II. And I wonder if designers took inspiration from that little crease that runs partway down the body on the Continental Mark II in creating the belt line on the 61 Continental. It also reminds me a little bit of the belt line on the Tri-5 Chevrolets. It has that little dip in it, but I think the inspiration here was more than likely than not that Continental Mark II crease. And one last look at the rear end of the vehicle. I will point out that in that beautiful trim panel that has the Lincoln logo, the midsection there is where the fuel filler door is. So it's kind of beautifully disguised here in the middle of the car underneath the Lincoln logo. The other thing I'll point out is that Elwood Engel maybe took this kind of philosophy of styling where you have the quarters that are high and then you have the deck lid that kind of tapers over to Chrysler, where he would redo the 1963 New Yorker and the rear that had a taper to it and give the car fins for 1964. And that's another car that, as a consequence, kind of reveals itself to you as you walk around it, because the quarter panels with the mini fins kind of disguise the shape of the deck lid. And that was Engel's intent on that particular vehicle. Now, when it comes to styling, the exterior of the 61 Continental is beautiful, but so is the interior. The tasteful use of wood trim on the door panels, the instrument panel, the kind of twin cockpit theme that you see here, the gorgeous design of the steering wheel with the recessed center hub and the horn ring. It's just perfection. The car is perfection inside and out. I don't know what else to say about it other than this is not an overly rich-looking interior. It's just a finely detailed interior. There's no shag carpet or, let's say, door panels that are extra poofy or a dash that is over-adorned. Everything is just tasteful and elegant in that mid-century modern flair kind of way. Just a beautiful car overall. Maybe the only flaw in the interior is that the speedometer is actually very small, as you can see here, but it's gorgeous, and it's flanked by some gauges on the left and the clock on the right in the shape of the Lincoln logo. It's very tasteful, and I love how you have the controls that are laid out underneath the speedometer for the HVAC and the wipers, etc. The radio's off there to the right, but just a fantastic looking design. And I even like kind of the faux wood end to the column shifter, just a nice touch. Now under hood in these Continentals, you have the Mercury Edsel Lincoln, or MEL, 430 cubic inch V8. And it's kind of shoehorned in here, like I was saying before. It's not overly large in terms of the size of the engine compartment, especially when you have the air conditioning, let's say, and all the different accessories in here. And gone were the dual evaporators of the 58 to 60 Lincolns. This just has a single evaporator. You can see the two-piston air conditioning compressor off there on the driver's side, the surge tank for the radiator. What you won't see under hood here is a power steering pump, at least visibly. And that's because the power steering pump is run off the end of the crankshaft. It's not run off an accessory drive on these engines. That would be something that Ford would continue on engines for Lincoln, as an example, up through 1969. And even on that 1969 engine, the new 460 that had come out, Ford engineered that power steering pump to the end of the 460 cubic inch V8, even though it was an all-new V8 that had superseded the MEL a few years prior. Another unfortunate thing about the 430 in these years was that Robert McNamara was not a fan of four-barrel carburetors. He thought they were excessive. So this 430 cubic inch engine has a two-barrel carburetor, makes 300 horsepower. It's too bad because it had a four-barrel carburetor back in 1958, and it was producing considerably more horsepower, I believe 375 horsepower in that zip code, and now it was down to just 300. It had been detuned and two-barrelized. It would later get its four-barrel again after Robert McNamara would leave the Ford Motor Company. So what do you think about the 1961 Continental and this one in particular? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.